The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents the argument from Contingency. So one of the patrons sent me an email and asked if I would actually cover the argument from Contingency, and the answer was, of course, yes. This is one of many arguments that is on the magical whiteboard list of arguments to cover, and in fact, I had originally planned to cover both the Kalam cosmological argument and the argument from Contingency in one video. I'm sure that would have rattled some cages, as these things really need individual treatment, but there are some similarities. And so I figured what we'd do this time is cover the argument from Contingency, talk about my thoughts on this argument, and then when we get to the Kalam cosmological argument later, we will look back at elements from this to see where there are similarities. Some of the similarities are going to be obvious. They are both, in a sense, cosmological arguments. And this raises a point that I've wanted to cover for quite a while, and that is sometimes someone will email and say, what do you think about the teleological argument, or the ontological argument, the cosmological argument? And in reality, there's no such thing as the argument for a given category. We categorize the arguments for the existence of God based on what they're talking about. And so there's a category of teleological arguments, which there could be many of. There could be a new teleological argument tomorrow, probably only mildly, subtly different from the classical versions that we're aware of. There could be a new version of the moral argument. There are several versions of ontological arguments, even taking some of the classic ones and redoing them with modal logic. And there are several cosmological arguments, whether it's the Kalam cosmological argument or first cause versions. And the subject of today's video, the argument from Contingency. So before we get started on an actual presentation of that argument, what do we mean by contingency? So when philosophers talk about things that are contingent, which we'll need to understand for this argument from Contingency, all they mean is that there's something about the nature of this item, that its very existence is contingent upon something else. It doesn't have an explanation that is internal to itself, but it has a reason for being which comes from outside of that individual item. The contingency is contrasted with necessity. Necessary items are ones which don't have an external explanation for their existence. They just exist necessarily. There is something about their very nature such that they had to exist. There's no possibility that they couldn't have existed, whereas contingent things could have, at least hypothetically, not existed. One prime example is you. Your existence is contingent upon the existence of your parents, the existence of their method of procreation, and it continues a chain backwards. Your parents' existence is contingent upon their parents, etc. If we were to find something that had a necessary existence, we could contrast this much more easily. The problem is it's very hard to clearly identify something that has a necessary existence that is in fact a thing that we can point to, like a brick or a piece of wood or this seat. These things are all contingent on other things. And this connection of finding things in the universe that are contingent and expanding this to say that the universe is contingent is something we'll talk about when we get to the formal structure of the argument. One of the issues with the argument from Contingency is that we don't really see a clear definition of what type of contingency we're talking about within the argument. This is perhaps intentional, it's perhaps a bait and switch, a little equivocation. But it's important to realize that when we talk about things which are contingent, there's really two versions of contingency we're talking about. The first is causal. Your parents reproduced. This resulted in you. Your existence is causally contingent upon their existence and their method of reproduction. The other version of contingency is sustaining contingency. And that is something like the heat and energy that we get from the sun, the light that is encompassing me right now coming from the sun. It is contingent upon the sun, but it is contingent in a sustaining sense, which is if the sun goes away, this light goes away. Whereas if your parents go away, you don't necessarily go away. So when we talk about contingency, we're talking about the reason for something existing, but we also need to consider, is this a causal contingency in that this is the cause and this is the effect, or is this a sustaining contingency, as if you were pouring water out of a jug, that the existence of water flowing from that jug is contingent upon the jug being there and continuing to pour out water. That's not always clear when the argument from contingency is presented. So let's take a look at one version, or two versions actually, of the argument from contingency. So one classical version of the argument from contingency goes like this. 1. Everything that exists contingently has a reason for its existence. 2. The universe exists contingently. 3. The universe has a reason for its existence. 4. If the universe has a reason for its existence, then that reason is God. And 5, therefore God exists. Now, I imagine some of the responses out there, there are people who accept the argument from contingency, who are theists of some stripe and say, yep, that's one of the versions. Sounds just fine to me. What could you possibly be objecting to? And there are probably many non-believers out there, and people who've looked at this sort of thing before, who might be screaming and ready to pull out their hair about how can they say that? What's the justification for this claim? And it may have come at different times. One of the things about the argument from contingency that distinguishes it from other cosmological arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument or for various versions of first cause arguments, and there are similarities, there are elements of a first cause argument in here. But the claim is often that the argument from contingency would apply if in fact the universe was infinite. That's not entirely true in my estimation. Yes, by talking about the nature and saying that if the universe is contingent, it could perhaps be infinite or eternal, and yet it is contingent upon the existence of a God or the sustaining influence of a God. It might have existed forever, and so it might apply to the cosmos. But generally, when we talk about contingent things, we are also talking about something that had a beginning. The idea of an eternal thing that is also contingent upon something is not only counterintuitive, it may be obviously false. It may be that there's a contradiction there of having both the thing that is contingent and the thing that it is contingent on having no beginning. It would seem intuitive that if something is contingent, it had a beginning. As a matter of fact, a lot of versions of arguments from contingency rely on this idea that the universe, in fact, did have a beginning. And we may be talking about different things when we're talking about universe, because we managed to get the universe label as a label for everything, but our understanding of the universe has changed the way this label is used, such that with the idea of a multiverse, with the idea of alternate dimensions, even though we can't confirm these things, what we mean by universe is typically our local space-time reality that we can explore, that we inhabit, and the word cosmos is used to talk about everything. The cosmos would include a multiverse, whether one exists or not. The cosmos would include alternate realities, alternate universes. No matter what the actual reality of the model is, the cosmos encompasses all of that. And is the cosmos actually contingent? Is the universe contingent? Is it contingent on the cosmos? But let's take a look at the premises and the arguments, what this argument actually says, and see if we can find some points where we perhaps disagree. It begins with the idea that everything that exists contingently has a reason for its existence. And this is true, or I'm convinced that it's true, but this is also true for non-contingent things, for necessary things. You could just as easily say everything that exists has a reason for its existence, and then you would be drawing a distinction between things which are contingent, where the reason for its existence is external to the thing you're discussing, and things that are necessary. Their reason is internal. It is part of their makeup. They require no external support or generation. They are necessary things. They still have a reason. The reason is just that they're necessary. They exist because they exist. And that puts some people off when you start speaking in those terms. But to me, when you say everything that exists contingently has a reason for its existence, okay, fine. that's a tautology. And I think it would also be true of things that were non-contingent. It's just the reason is very different. But premise 2 is that the universe exists contingently. And here's where we get into this discussion about what do we mean by universe? Do we mean our local space-time reality that we inhabit? The thing that is 14.5 billion years old that we can, see the edges of, see the microwave background radiation, that we have a suspicion about how it began. We have Big Bang cosmology, even though there are competing models. This isn't about declaring what version is correct. This is about saying, is the universe contingent? Well, it may be the case that the universe is contingent, but I don't see a demonstration that it is. It may also be the case that if we're talking about the cosmos, the larger everything that our universe exists within or as part of, that the cosmos, in fact, is not contingent, that the cosmos is a necessary thing. We'll get to that in a little bit. The third is that the universe has a reason for its existence. I've already acknowledged from point 1 that I think that that's going to be true, whether it is contingent or necessary. And then on number 4, we get to this, if the universe has a reason for its existence, then that reason is God. How did we get here? Now, the truth of the matter is that in philosophical circles and apologetic circles, when you're talking about perhaps this version of the argument from contingency, the argument doesn't exist merely on its own. There are a number of justifications. This argument itself is contingent upon these explanations for why they can claim that the universe, if it has a reason for its existence, that reason is God. But that's not contained in the argument, and it's not here for us to address, and I'm not convinced that that's actually the case. And that means that the conclusion they end up reaching, that God exists, is as questionable as this premise that the explanation, the reason for a contingent universe is a God. But this conclusion just assumes already a sustaining version of contingency. So if we were to concede that all of the points so far are correct, that everything that it is contingent has a reason for its existence, the universe is contingent, therefore the universe has a reason for its existence. If the universe has a reason for its existence, this reason must be God. This final conclusion that God exists does not follow from the argument unless the argument is about a sustaining version of contingence. And this isn't argued as in any case. For premise 4, where it says if the universe has a reason for its existence, and that reason is God, is one that hasn't been demonstrated, it's merely asserted. But also, we're not clear as to whether this is asserting that the best explanation for the existence of the universe is this thing that they're going to call God. How did they determine that this is a sustaining thing versus a causal thing? For example, there could have been a God who created a universe and ceased to exist, perhaps spewing forth its essence to create the universe and then cease to exist, in which case we would still have a universe that is contingent and a universe where it is contingent upon a God, but that God no longer exists. So there has to be more here, even to get to the final conclusion that they want, which is that God exists. Because the real conclusion from this, even if you were to accept the first 4, which we don't, is that a God is the explanation for the origin of the universe, that the universe is contingent upon a God. It's not necessarily contingent upon a God in a sustaining sense. Now, if it's possible for these arguments to get any worse, it tends to happen when we use some shortcuts. We already have a number of problems here where we've just asserted that a God is the best explanation of the universe. But I want to address William Lane Craig's version of this, or at least one of the versions that William Lane Craig has used. He wrote a little kind of response to questions about the argument from contingency, and the version that he listed looks like this. Number 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Number 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Number 3, the universe exists. And then he continues on with, therefore God exists is what he ultimately gets to. Craig argues that items number 1 and number 3 aren't really assailable. And I would pretty much agree. Argument number 1, or point number 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. This is basically saying everything is either contingent or not contingent. Either contingent or necessary is the label that we would put on it. Contingent things require an external explanation. Necessary things have an internal explanation. Its own nature is the reason why it exists. Number 2 is, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Number 3, the universe exists. I agree. And so what we can look at here is that the universe exists. And so we go back to point 1. Because it exists, it has an explanation for its existence that is either internal, a matter of necessity that the universe necessarily exists, or external, that it is contingent upon something. We're in agreement. I just don't know where Craig decides to use, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, the explanation is God. And while I don't want this entire video to be a rebuttal to one thing that William Lane Craig said, the fact of the matter is that when discussing this, instead of arguing and presenting any justification for his second premise, that if there's an explanation for the universe, that explanation is God, he instead tries to argue a little differently. He says that if atheism is true, and here he has to be talking about hard atheism or anti-theism, or basically the claim that no God exists. So on non-theism would probably be a better way to put this. Then the universe has no explanation of its existence. And if the universe has an explanation for its existence, then atheism isn't true. Instead of defending why he gets to just assert that there's a God, he goes on to make additional assertions. His claim is that if there's not a God, then the universe doesn't have an explanation for its existence. Well, how did you determine that? I mean, you're living in a universe. Clearly it's here. Either there's a God or there's not. And if there's not a God, how did you determine that a universe couldn't exist? Even if the universe is contingent, it might be contingent on a multiverse or on something in the cosmos. But Craig's thing is, in order to argue for his premise that the explanation for the universe is God, he just says, if there's not a God, then the universe doesn't have an explanation. And if the universe has an explanation, then there must be a God. This is just a bald assertion that makes the entire discussion about his second premise circular. Now, we're stuck with this word universe, as we've talked about. There may be equivocation fallacies involved, but is the universe all there is? And as I mentioned before, I'll be using cosmos, and I'll try to do that in all the videos everywhere when I'm talking about all there is. If you were raised and born on an island, you might think that the entire world was your island. And so you might have a word that you would use, the world. And then at some point, when you figured out that there were other continents and other islands and other lands for you to explore, your definition of what the world is would expand. This is kind of what's happened with the universe. As we've explored more, we've discovered that we're probably best off, it would be ideal, based on the actual transliteration of universe or its origins, if we used it to describe everything and instead used a condensed label like our local universe or our real space-time, but we don't. And that's why we draw a distinction between the universe and the cosmos. Now, contingency arguments merely assert that the explanation for the universe must be a being and a necessary non-contingent one. They don't ever demonstrate this in any way, nor do they demonstrate that this being explanation must be one in which this being still exists, the difference between a causal contingency and a sustaining contingency. Why is that? I mean, after all, they believe in a God that exists. I mean, these arguments aren't just coming from deistic notions, even though they are all consistent with a deistic notion of a God. These are quite often fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, moderate Christians, seminarians, apologists, all who believe in Jesus. These are also arguments coming from Muslims to argue for their God. How is it that these different religions can use the same argument for the existence of God and yet believe in different gods? Now, this isn't an argument in any way to show that they're wrong. If there was in fact a God, arguments for the existence of God would apply to all the religions that would point to a similar God. This is an expression of the concern that I have that people aren't defending the God they believe in. And when they instead offer arguments like this, like the argument from contingency, the Kalam cosmological argument, things like this, not only are they not arguing for the God that they actually believe in, but the argument that they're presenting doesn't get us to a God exists. The conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, is not therefore God exists, it is therefore the universe has a cause. And the conclusion of the versions of the argument from contingency, while they might be God exists, we can see that there's a disconnect between there is some non-contingent thing that it serves as an ultimate foundation, and this idea that the non-contingent thing that serves as an ultimate foundation is a thinking being that they're going to call God, and then they're going to extrapolate from that down to the particular God they believe in the religious doctrine. What if our local universe began to exist and has a cause for its existence, has a reason, an explanation for its existence, that isn't actually an agent, a thinking being? What if it is a natural explanation, and natural in the sense of it is a part of the cosmos, but not necessarily a thinking agent putting forth some sort of creative effort? The truth is, we don't know why there's something instead of nothing. There are a number of people who would tell you that it's because nothing is intrinsically unstable, and therefore something is going to emerge from nothing. But we don't have an understanding of a mechanism. And since we can't explore beyond the origins of our universe, we can only hypothesize. And if that's the case, how did we determine that the foundational, essential explanation for our universe is that it is a contingent entity that is derived from a thinking agent? I see absolutely no justification for this, definitely not within the arguments. And this is one of the things that needs to start happening. If you're going to present an argument, when you offer up your premises, you need to offer reasons for those premises. You may have to add additional arguments to it, and that doesn't always happen. This shorthand version of the argument from contingency, both of the versions we've looked at today, have this bald assertion in there: if the universe has a reason for its existence, then that reason is God. Now, I know, because I've studied this, that they think they have reasons for it. They will say, oh, well, it has to be something that's non-contingent, that serves as the origin of our universe, and it has to have these particular qualities. It has to be capable of creating a universe. It has to be capable of causing a universe to exist, and it goes on and on and on. And it's then their conclusion is that the God hypothesis is the only thing that we know of that fits those criteria. The problem here is the God hypothesis is not something we know of, and these arguments are relying on a long history of mankind inventing deities, inventing ideas that are sufficient to explain what the unknown, but they aren't necessarily necessary to explain the unknown. So if you live in a culture that has been taught from birth that, yep, there's a God, if you live in a culture where even individuals who weren't raised to believe in a God are still familiar with this concept of an all-powerful divine being that is not bound by space and time, that exists eternally, then it will seem reasonable to say that, given the unknown origin of the universe, given the unknown causal foundation for the universe, upon which our universe is contingent, the only entity that we're aware of that could possibly do this is a God. It had to be thinking, it had to be intentional, it couldn't just be an accident. All of these things are preying upon our intuitions. We don't want the existence of everything to have been an accident. And by the way the universe progresses from its beginning to where I am now, sitting in my backyard on a swing, is not just a series of accidents. There is order in the universe. There are physical laws that must be obeyed. And this is why there's so much confusion about the process of evolution by natural selection. People want to just say, oh, you just think it was all an accident that did it. No, it may have been an accident that perhaps started the fire, but it's not an accident that the fire then followed the path of burnt grass, or of dry grass, and stayed away from the water, because fire doesn't actually consume water like that. What if the cosmos is actually necessary? What if the cosmos is necessary and serves as the foundation, perhaps a scenario like the multiverse, where there's no intelligent being that is, oh, let me make a universe. Here we go. I am now made a universe. That universe is contingent upon me. What if instead there's a cosmos that we can't explore and we can't understand, that has mechanisms in it that causes universes to arise? Now, I have no way of demonstrating that this is in fact the case, but the possibility that this is the case, or the fact that nobody's demonstrated that it's not the case, shows us that they cannot assert that the best explanation for the universe is contingent, is a God, because they cannot show which of the two possibilities we have, a necessary cosmos that has the necessary capability of producing universes, or a God that has the necessary characteristics to produce a universe. They have no way to demonstrate which of those two is in fact more likely. So the argument from contingency is one version of a cosmological argument. There are a variety of different versions of the argument from contingency, and at least all of the ones that I've seen have within them this bald, unsupported assertion that the foundational thing upon which the universe is contingent is a God. They don't tell us anything about the characteristics of this God within the arguments. They'll try and do that outside of it. This God is eternal and powerful, et cetera, et cetera. And as I mentioned, it relies on our intuitions, living in a culture where a lot of people believe in a God, people talk about a God. What happens is when you present something like this and you say, okay, if our universe is contingent, if it's not necessary, if it could have been the case that our universe didn't come into existence, which we're not sure if that's the case or not, what is the best explanation for this? And in cultures where people have been positing a God, the vast majority of people are likely to say, well, oh yeah, of course, it must be a God. I can't think of anything else. What else could it be? These are essentially arguments from ignorance or arguments from incredulity, that we've really got no better idea than this God thing. The problem is that the God thing isn't necessarily a good idea. It's not anything we can demonstrate. We don't have any way to calculate the probability of a God, and we don't even have a way to calculate its likelihood in comparison to alternate hypotheses. Things like a multiverse, things like a cosmos that was necessary. When we talk about the argument from contingency, when people want to claim that the universe is contingent, they may in fact be committing the fallacy of composition, because their reasons for assuming that the universe is contingent is to say that, look, I look around in the universe and every single thing I look at is contingent, and they're taking the property of the constituent components of a universe and then saying that the universe must then also have that property. And that is almost a textbook fallacy of composition. Now, the universe may or may not be contingent, and the cosmos may in fact be contingent, or it may be necessary. We don't know. We can't get to that point. But as soon as we get comfortable with this idea that a God is the best explanation for it, what happens next is something we see within syncretic compositions of religion, and religions as they grow and change throughout time. And that is, we get away from the Bible, the Quran, the doctrinal orthodox versions, but we're desperate to cling on to the idea, the notion of a God, because it keeps us from feeling too ignorant. And so people will actually redefine God and say, God is that thing which explains the origin of the universe. They've told us nothing. They've given us no clear description of the attributes or characterizations that you would find in a God, except to say that here's a big mystery. We don't know how this came about, but whatever the properties are that explain that mystery, those are the property that we're going to label God. That's not a proof for the existence of God. It's not an argument for the existence of God. It's a proof that we're prone to assumptions. It's a proof that we are terrified of not knowing. We're terrified of our ignorance. That in the reality that we inhabit, whether it is contingent or not, we are limited not just by our current intellect and current levels of knowledge, but perhaps limited permanently from finding the answers to some of the biggest questions. We may be able to find them, we may not. Why is there something instead of nothing? What we're really talking about is existence. Why does existence exist? And it would seem to me that if there was an example of anything that would be considered necessary and non-contingent, it would be existence. That existence exists necessarily. And I think that there's a good argument to be made that the cosmos is at least partially synonymous with existence. It is the fabric, in a metaphoric sense, that undergirds our universe, other potential universes, multiverses, things that we're not even completely aware of. And to say, why is there something rather than nothing when we're talking about something like existence, is to misunderstand the question itself. It's just not very comforting to people to say it exists because it exists. And instead of recognizing this discomfort and acknowledging that at least for now it may be the best, most accurate explanation that we may be currently blocked, instead some people have taken it in stride and created an argument that asserts that no, existence doesn't just exist. It has another foundation. It has a foundation in a God. It has taken our discomfort with the idea that we might have to acknowledge we can't have an explanation for this, or this, it doesn't need an explanation. And it's painted this warm, fuzzy, man in the sky cares about us, God type of model, which, by the way, we don't seem to be able to confirm or know anything about. And the argument is that this being exists necessarily, that it needs no explanation for its existence. There were a number of different first cause arguments and discussions about absolute infinities and actual infinities versus non-actual infinities that take place in the first cause arguments. We get into temporal issues and things like that. And I remember a discussion where someone said, well, the universe must have had a cause. And of course, the question after they assert that God must, was the cause is, well, what's the cause of God? What's the explanation for God? Well, God doesn't need an explanation. And there were many people who pointed out that instead of just talking about the universe that began 14.5 billion years ago, or 13.7 billion years ago, instead of saying, oh, it definitely needs an explanation, but the thing that explains it doesn't need an explanation, why don't we stop at the limits of our knowledge and say, for now, because we are barred from exploring beyond the beginning, and even when we talk about before the beginning, that may be a nonsensical term, why don't we just acknowledge that we don't have an explanation for the existence of existence, and that it may in fact not need an explanation, and that if someone ever finds an explanation, we can consider that then. But the cosmological arguments, the versions that we've seen, and especially the argument from contingency, don't demonstrate that a God exists. They just merely assert, without justification, that there must be some non-contingent thing upon which a universe sits on this foundation, and that thing is God, and that God is necessary and does not need an explanation. I don't know how that solves a problem at all, but I think it tells us a lot about who we are, what we're afraid of, and how we're willing to just go with assumptions that are comforting, whether or not they're actually true. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.